Today's video is sponsored by Shudder. Shudder is a premium video service brought to you by AMC Networks, offering an unbeatable selection of expertly curated horror, supernatural, and thrillers, uncut and commercial-free, with exclusive and original titles you won't find anywhere else. Start your free trial today, risk-free. You can stream great thrillers, horror, and suspense for $5.99 per month or $56.99 per year. Shudder has the largest, fastest-growing human-curated selection of thrilling and dangerous entertainment. It's called the Netflix of horror. There are new spine-tingling thrillers, shocking horrors, and edge-of-your-seat suspense added weekly. You'll have unlimited access to stream ad-free on all your favorite devices: iPhone, iPad, Apple TV, Xbox One, Amazon Fire TV, Google Chromecast, Roku, Android devices, really anything you can think of. Shudder has a unique collection of exclusive and original films and series, horror classics, and blockbuster hits. Some of the ones I've been loving are Horror Noir, which is a Shudder original documentary that traces the untold history of Black Americans in Hollywood through their connection to the horror genre, as well as Three from Hell, which follows the Firefly clan as they release a firestorm of murder, madness, and mayhem, exactly what I'd expect from a Rob Zombie-directed gore fest. Get started streaming the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content. Shudder's expertly curated collection includes titles like the acclaimed Tigers Are Not Afraid, One Cut of the Dead, Revenge, and the Creepshow TV series produced by Greg Nicotero and based on the famous films by George Romero. To try Shudder free for 30 days, go to Shudder.com and use promo code LET'sRead. That's 30 days free of Shudder, risk-free. Go to SHUDDER.com and use promo code LET'sRead. Phoenix Luna grew up in Tokyo's Tochigi Prefecture. He had a difficult upbringing and at one point was forced to live in a youth institution when his father abandoned his family and his mother could not afford to raise him. After graduating middle school, he gained work in the construction industry, but after a few years quit due to personal issues and ended up homeless on the streets of Tokyo. At just 20 years old, he was penniless and impoverished, but being young and good-looking, he managed to find work as a bar host at a joint called Fusion by Youth. For those that don't know, Tokyo's Kabukicho district is home to a number of bars and clubs known as Hatsuto Karubu. These are places where female customers pay for male company, who are known as bar hosts. Male hosts pour drinks for their clients and will often engage in flirtatious conversations. These conversations are generally lighthearted, and hosts tend to have a variety of entertainment skills, ranging from simple magic tricks to the ability to tell engaging stories. A host's age usually ranges from 18 to 27, and they will often take a stage name, usually taken from a favorite manga, film, or historical figure that describes their character or persona, hence why the young man in question is known here as Phoenix Luna, and not by his birth name, which he has kept a closely guarded secret. Men who become hosts are often those who either cannot find a white-collar job or are enticed by the prospect of high earnings through commission. It was these prospects that attracted Luna to the hosting scene, and the job saved him from a life of homelessness and destitution. But it was through his work as a bar host that Luna met a person that would change his life forever, a 21-year-old woman named Yuka Takaoka. Yuka was employed as the manager of a so-called girls' bar, the female equivalent of the kind of place Luna worked at. She worked long hours and found it very difficult to meet men she was actually attracted to, and found herself frequenting host bars since they revolved around a concept she understood all too well. This was how she met Luna, and upon meeting him in October of 2018, she was instantly smitten. Over the next 7 months, she cultivated a kind of relationship with him and became one of his regular customers. Luna made her feel special, often telling her that he liked her and that he wished to be with her. Hosts are generally forbidden from socializing with their clients outside of working hours, but Luna made an exception for Yuka. They often met at Yuka's fifth-floor apartment in Shinjuku Ward, where they shared food and watched movies, and after a few months of doing so, Yuka asked Luna if he would like to pursue an exclusive relationship with her. Luna replied that he would, but was taken aback when one of her conditions for doing so was that he quit hosting and find a regular job. She was adamant that he would have to stop flirting with other women, whether that be in a professional capacity or otherwise. This was something Luna could not adhere to. He enjoyed his work and considered his fellow hosts as a kind of surrogate family. Reluctantly, he was forced to decline Yuka's offer, but told her they could continue to see each other if that was something she wanted. Yuka was heartbroken. She adored Luna and became increasingly depressed as a result of his rejection. This depression morphed into jealousy and thoughts of taking her own life, and eventually, Yuka hatched a plan for the pair to be together forever. On May the 23rd, 2019, Yuka asked Luna to meet her at her apartment to assist with some cleaning work. They agreed to meet at around noon, but due to work commitments, Luna was delayed by around 3 hours. By the time he arrived, he was exhausted and told Yuka that he would like to take a nap before they commenced the cleaning work. Luna took a quick bath and then climbed into bed with Yuka, where he fell asleep in her arms. He awoke a short time later with an intense pain in his stomach. At first, Luna thought he was suffering from stomach cramps after eating bad food, but when he looked down, he saw the bed sheets were soaked with blood. That's when he saw a large kitchen knife buried into his gut, turning to see Yuka standing over him, her eyes wide with feverish anger. Coursing with adrenaline, Luna leapt from the bed and ran from the apartment to escape his obsessive attacker and to seek medical help. But Yuka gave chase. Luna managed to fight her off as they reached the building's elevator, but had lost so much blood by the time he reached the lobby that he collapsed to the floor and passed out. But before he lost consciousness, Luna saw Yuka kneeling over his body. "Please don't kill me," he begged. "I like you." Yuka smiled, and the world went black. Police soon received a call that a man had been stabbed in an apartment complex in Shinjuku. They arrived shortly afterward to find the unconscious Luna with Yuka sitting by his body, covered in his blood and smoking a cigarette. A photograph was taken of this scene, which quickly circulated online, a photograph that is still remarkably easy to obtain via Google image searches. Yuka was quickly arrested, putting up no resistance, and showed absolutely no remorse for her actions. In fact, there is another photograph of Yuka that was taken while she was sitting in the back of the police car after she'd been arrested. A huge, excited smile is etched across her face, which is extremely disturbing given that she had recently almost disemboweled someone she claimed to love so much. When police questioned her motives for the crime, Yuka told them, "Since I loved him so much, I just couldn't help it. I was sad and seeking to die and thought how I would like to go about it," she said. "I thought I would kill him because I thought that was how I could be with him. I thought that expressions such as 'I like you' and 'I'd like to be with you' would become a reality if we both die. I did not want to go anywhere, so I sat down at the outside staircase. I didn't call emergency services because I intended to end my own life after watching him die from the stabbing." In the aftermath of the stabbing, social media users all over the world fixated over her behavior, especially those with an interest in the Japanese concept of yandere, a name used to describe obsessive, jealous female lovers. Those with an interest in the phenomenon shared Yuka's Instagram account, one where she posted images of her dressed as various anime characters, which attracted all kinds of unsavory male attention from those who idolized her good looks and painfully overlooked her murderous psychopathology. Some even said she was too beautiful to be an attempted murder suspect. Luna had lost so much blood in the incident that it took him 5 whole days to regain consciousness in a nearby hospital. Doctors have him a mere 1 in 5 chance at recovery when he had first arrived, but somehow he had beaten the odds and pulled through after a series of surgeries to repair the catastrophic damage done to his internal organs. At first, I had no voice, so speaking was not possible, and I was bedridden, so I couldn't walk alone for a while, Luna said in a statement to journalists. I also couldn't eat after the incident, and I got quite thin. When I thought back to when I was stabbed and considered what I'd do in the future, I was unable to sleep due to anxiety and fear, and for that I received counseling. Yet bizarrely, despite his near-death experience at the hands of Yuka, Luna stated that he did not hold any ill feeling toward her. I do not hold a grudge. I think there's a reason for her to stab me. It was also thanks to her that I was able to achieve the sales that I did in less than a year since I'd become a host. The incident also had one unexpected result. After Luna arrived at the hospital, police sought to locate one of his blood relatives. I met my older brother and older sister for the first time in 5 years, he said. I'll be very happy to stay in touch with them in the future. I think we can agree that the result is a heartwarming, wholesome end to a frankly terrifying ordeal, and that Luna had showed an extraordinary amount of bravery to return to his job as a bar host. But surely, it is only a matter of time before another girl develops an obsession with him, and we can only hope that it doesn't end in the same terrifying, bloody way. So this happened back when I was living and working in Japan as part of my job here in Australia. One evening after work, I was out drinking with a Japanese mate in Ikebukuro. We had to be up pretty early the next morning, so around 9 p.m. we said our goodbyes and I headed off to catch the subway back to the company apartment. As I approached the ticket machines in Ikebukuro station, I heard this loud thud, almost like a footy being kicked. Then I heard it again, but I'm a bit wobbly at the time, so I don't react straight away. Only when I've gotten my tickets do I actually turn, seeing a crowd of Japanese people stood in a large circle. I peer over them as I'm walking past, only to see this skinny bloke lying on the white-tiled floor. Standing over him is this absolute unit of a guy with a shaved head, who pulls back his foot before just welling the unconscious bloke as hard as he could in the ribs. The crunching sound his boot made was bloody sickening, but not a single person standing around them said or did anything. I learned pretty quickly not to try to impose Aussie values on Japan. It's a completely different culture, one where people tend to not get involved in each other's business or display an extreme emotion. Like, I don't think I'll ever get over how bloody quiet it is in their subway cars, almost like if anyone makes a sound, they'll be yeeted off the thing in an instant. But dear God, you don't just kick a bloke when he's down, and if you're in Australia and you do, expect someone to intervene sharpish. But suddenly, I realize why no one is getting involved. I catch a glimpse of the kicking bloke's wrist as his sleeves pull back, and they're covered in tattoos. Same with his neck. Poking out from his shirt collar are all these traditional Japanese tattoos. He's Yakuza, a Japanese gangster. Then the Yakuza bloke does something mental. He reaches down and, with an obscene display of raw strength, grabs the unconscious man by the hair before lifting him up with one hand, until he was just dangling in the air in front of him. He then whipped the man's head onto the tile floor as hard as he possibly could. The whole crowd gasped at the noise the bloke's skull made when it bounced off the tiles, and there was what I can only describe as an explosion of blood that started to pour out of the poor bloke's face. But the Yakuza fellow wasn't done. He actually starts kicking the bloke all over again, to the point where I was stood there thinking, this poor guy isn't going to survive this if someone doesn't do something. Then I do something that, in hindsight, seems supremely stupid. I waded in and gave the Yakuza bloke a quick shove as if to say, leave it. I'm not saying I'm the bravest bloke around, and I know how daft it was to lay hands on a proper gangster like that, but there weren't any police around. There weren't even any JR station attendants about either, only the 20 or 30 bystanders who made it pretty bloody obvious that they weren't about to step in. In the moments after the shove, the Yakuza went absolutely beet red with anger, and I honestly thought he was about to just knock my block off. God knows he could probably have done so with a single right hook. He then steps forward until we're about 6 inches apart, then did something I was definitely not expecting. He lowers his gaze, nods slightly, then reaches his hand vertically. The Japanese gesture of, sorry to trouble you, as if he'd just stepped on my foot or something. Then he walks out of the situation and just disappears. Only when he'd scarpered did anyone actually do anything. Then everyone's on their bloody phone all at once, calling the police, the ambulance, or just friends to tell them what happened. I stayed by the unconscious bloke's body for a bit, just sort of trying to wake him up and check if he was actually still breathing. Luckily, he was. But how he could have survived that kind of punishment was beyond me. Only when the Japanese cops had turned up did I leave. But when they asked me if I'd seen anything, I took a cue from the Japanese people around me and just sort of told them I hadn't actually seen anything, then caught the subway home. When I got to my stop, I went to the convenience store and bought a grapefruit chew high to just calm myself down as I was still shaking with adrenaline. I couldn't believe I'd gotten away with shoving a Yakuza like that, and although I didn't get hurt, it was definitely the scariest thing that happened to me while working in Japan. So I've never actually been to Japan, so I don't have any personal stories to share here, but I do know someone who has, and who has plenty of horrifying and scary stories to tell about his time there, my grandpa. You see, he served in the Marines during World War II and fought in the Battle of Okinawa towards the end of the war. My dad said that he never really spoke about his time in the Marine Corps when he was growing up, but as time went on, and the mental scars of war healed more and more, I guess he just got more comfortable with talking about it. He's told me a few crazy stories about being on the Liberty in Japan, getting drunk and fighting with other Marines, and some pretty crazy gambling stories too. But as you can imagine, they're not particularly scary. Same can be said for some of his combat stories too. Like they're intense, but nothing I'd describe as particularly frightening. But there's this one story he told me that's always stuck in my mind as being one of the most frightening things I'd ever heard, equal parts disturbing, shocking, and obscene. If there are any history nerds reading this, don't go too hard on me if I get like dates and stuff wrong. This is me telling his story secondhand. But anyway, here it goes. So the way my grandpa tells it, he was just 17 and he enlisted in the Marines, as he was allowed to do so back then if he got his father's permission. He went through basic training, graduated as a rifleman, and was on a ship headed out into the Pacific on his 18th birthday, arriving within the main fleet in time for the invasion of Okinawa in April of 1945. My grandpa told me that the battle was only supposed to last a couple of weeks at most. The Japanese were weakened by that point and weren't expected to be able to defend Okinawa for very long. In the end, the battle lasted more than 2 months. The thing I always thought was messed up for my grandpa is that while the battle was going on, the Marines there got word that the war in Europe had ended. He had a cousin in the U.S. Army that took part in the Normandy landings, and for him the war was pretty much over. The Marine officer that announced the news said that they should be happy, but according to Grandpa, no one in his unit seemed to care. They were still stuck in Okinawa, fighting an enemy that was like 1,000 times more determined and psychopathic than the Nazis. At least, the Germans knew when they were beat, he once told me. So about 6 weeks into the battle, the Marines had the Japanese on the run, retreated towards this big old castle that they intended to use as a final layer of defense. But the whole time my grandpa's unit is advancing, there are snipers taking pop shots at them, all kinds of booby traps and spider holes the Japanese used to try and thin their numbers out before the final defense. So at one point, my grandpa says his platoon reached this ravine-type thing that sloped upward, basically the perfect ambush point. The officer in charge had the Marines waiting like an hour for aerial reconnaissance, but the cloud cover is so heavy that it takes way too long to get any of the planes to fly over. Then right as they're about to start looking for a way around the ravine, my grandpa and his squad mates see this Japanese woman walking down the ravine towards them. As she gets closer, they realize that she's a little wide around the waist, but not from too many bowls of ramen. No, this woman is pregnant and looks like she's about to pop at any moment. The Marines start beckoning her forward, but she can barely walk. She's leaning on rocks and cradling her stomach. What's more, she seems absolutely terrified. Eventually, the lieutenant in charge tells 2 Marines to advance up the ravine, while the rest of the platoon covers them so they can help the pregnant woman get to safety. They do so, squelching through the mud until they get to her before putting her arms around each of the soldiers. That's when the rest of the squad sees what's under her jacket thing. Rows of dynamite, or some kind of other explosives. She's covered in them. They start screaming warnings to the two guys that moved up to get her, but it was way too late to save them. Suddenly, there's a huge explosion that rips apart the pregnant woman and the two Marines supporting her. The rest of the platoon is showered in chunks of flesh and gore when, out of nowhere, the Japanese open up on them with machine guns from down the ravine. It was a perfectly executed ambush. For years, my grandpa hated the Japanese soldiers for all their dirty tricks and their savagery, he would say. But one thing was clear from the stories he told. He had this weird, begrudging respect for their warrior spirit. They were masters of war, as he put it, about the toughest enemy any soldier could ever dread to fight. There was no fighting them that day. The Marines simply had to pull back away from the ravine and call in fire missions from the big guns of the battleships offshore. Only when the shells had impacted on the other side of the ravine did the Japanese machine guns fall silent, and the Marines were able to clear the ravine and recover what little was left of their dead comrades. I'll always be haunted by the look in my grandpa's eyes when he told me about the shapes of body bags, how it was painfully obvious that there was a dead man in each of them. But the body bags they filled with the remains of their exploded buddies had no shape to them at all. They were just sacks of meat. That's not even covering the fact that he had to watch a pregnant woman die like that, how that haunted him for years and years. He told me he had nightmares we saw the woman's face, where he could hear her crying, or he could hear a baby crying too, crying because it never had the chance to be born. Like I said, that whole thing is probably the scariest, most disturbing thing I'd ever heard in my life. Knowing that every word of it is true is even more disturbing. It's not like some creepypasta or some over-the-top horror movie. It's real life. People actually witnessed that. People actually had the will to do something like that. And the fact that it actually happened to my grandpa just makes it all the more raw for me. And that's my story. Or rather, not my story, but it's definitely still the scariest thing about Japan I'd ever heard. Like I'd seriously rather spoon the girl from the ring instead of seeing something like that for real. In the year 2000, on the morning of New Year's Eve, Japanese grandmother Asahi Geino traveled over to her daughter's house in the Setagaya ward of western Tokyo to celebrate the coming of the New Year. Unlike many other Eastern Asian cultures, the official Japanese New Year has been celebrated according to the Gregorian calendar on January 1st of each year, as has been tradition since 1873. Asahi looked forward to these New Yearly visits, which usually involved her grandchildren partaking in the Japanese tradition of New Year's kite flying, known as takoage, before the family sat down together to watch the final of the Emperor's Cup, the Nations Association Football Elimination Tournament. She had called ahead to confirm the visit, but was surprised to find that her calls couldn't be patched through. This was highly unusual. Her daughter's family was financially stable and always paid their phone bill on time, so naturally she became suspicious and headed over to the house a few hours earlier than she planned to. Upon entering the residence, Asahi noticed that it was unusually quiet. She called out to her family, but there was no reply from any of them. There were signs of activity in the kitchen and around the family computer. Someone had not only eaten there recently, but had also used the computer to surf the internet. But Asahi didn't start to worry until she saw that someone had wrenched the phone line from the wall socket so hard it had broken off completely. Feelings of dread began to build in her as she climbed the first-floor stairs and peered into the family bedrooms. And when she laid eyes on the scenes that greeted her, she unleashed a blood-curdling scream so loud that the occupants of neighboring houses heard and quickly called the police. Her entire family had been murdered. A grisly scene greeted the police officers that rushed to the residence. There they discovered the corpses of 44-year-old Mikio Miyazawa, his 41-year-old wife Yasuko, and their children Nina and Rei, who were 8 and 6 years of age respectively. 3 of the corpses were soaked with blood, except Ray's, who had apparently been strangled in his sleep. Police quickly determined that whoever had slain the family had gained access to the house at around 11:30 p.m. the previous evening. They had climbed a tree to the rear of the house before carefully removing a window screen, after which they had free access to the bedroom of the sleeping Ray. Despite succumbing to the asphyxiation inflicted by the killer, Ray seems to have raised enough of an alarm for his father Mikio to rush up the stairs to confront his son's murderer. Shocked and enraged by the horrifying sight that greeted him, Mikio set upon the killer in a vengeful rage and actually managed to injure his son's attacker before losing its balance. The killer then gained the upper hand enough to stab Mikio in the head with a sashimi boko knife, a kind of blade used in the preparation of sushi. Mikio was stabbed in the head with such force that part of the blade snapped off inside of his skull, and the killer was forced to set about slaying the females of the family with a broken knife, one of which was still soaked in their father and husband's blood. In a country where the murder rate is relatively low, news of the murders shocked the Japanese public and caused national outrage, so much so that Takeshi Tsuchida, the chief of Seijo Police Station, was placed in charge of all investigations into the murders and remained in place until his retirement. The investigation that followed was one of the largest ever undertaken in the history of Japanese law enforcement. It involved almost 250,000 investigating officers who collected and filed over 12,000 pieces of evidence. The killer's behavior was brutal, merciless, and horrifying, but it was his apparent actions following the murder that the police found truly confusing. Instead of fleeing the scene, the killer then seemingly spent the next 8 hours or so simply hanging around the Miyazawa family's home. After treating their injuries using some medical supplies found in the family's bathroom, the killer then helped themselves to some barley tea and fresh melon, as well as some ice cream from the kitchen's freezer. Then, after using the house's toilet to relieve themselves, the killer had apparently used the family computer for a number of hours before actually taking a nap on the living room couch before seeing themselves out. Analysis of the family's computer revealed it had connected to the internet at 1 a.m., shortly after the family was murdered and the killer had eaten. It had also connected to the internet at around 10 a.m. the same morning, meaning Asahi Gano had arrived at the house maybe only an hour after the killer had departed. One thing was clear before any serious investigation had taken place. The police were dealing with a highly dangerous psychopath who was not only so detached from their crimes that they could stomach food in the immediate aftermath, but so callous that they could actually take a nap after having murdered 2 children and their parents. The subsequent police investigation revealed a number of oddly specific things about the family's killer. Physically, the killer was estimated to be around 170 centimeters tall and of a slender or athletic build. Police also deduced that the killer was 15 to 35 years old at the time of the incident, due to the physical strength required to scale the tree at the rear of Miyazawa's house. After analyzing fecal matter taken from the Miyazawa's bathroom that apparently belonged to the killer, police were able to determine that they had eaten string beans and sesame seeds the previous day. They also discovered the killer had left behind their blood-stained clothes in the father's bedroom, after having changed into some of his clean clothes to avoid raising any suspicions as he escaped the scene. Analyzing the killer's sweater, they not only learned that it had been bought from a store in Kanagawa Prefecture, but that only 130 of that particular item was made and sold. It was a pretty exclusive piece of clothing, and it didn't come cheap. Therefore, the killer must have been employed at a fair, well-paying job, and at least had had an interest in fashion. But perhaps the most interesting detail gleaned from the investigation was that traces amounts of sand were found inside the hip bag that the killer left abandoned at the crime scene. These were sent to a laboratory for analysis where forensic scientists concluded that they had come from the Nevada desert, specifically the area around Edwards Air Force Base in California. This fueled speculation that the murderer was either an American serviceman or had at least visited the area during the previous few years. Analysis of the killer's DNA and fingerprints also fueled speculation that the murder was committed by a foreigner. Neither the DNA nor the fingerprints matched any in the records of the Tokyo police, which could have simply meant that the killer had no previous criminal record. However, analysis of the type A blood found at the scene revealed that the killer was male, and indicated that their ancestry was that of a southern European country that bordered the Mediterranean or Adriatic seas. This discovery led the Tokyo Metropolitan Police to seek help from the International Crime Police Organization, as it was entirely possible that the killer was no longer present in Japan and had escaped the country following the brutal murders. This would explain why, after such a thorough and widespread investigation, that not a single person was ever charged with the murders. In 2019, it was reported that 35 officers are still assigned to the case, in the hopes of one day finally solving some of the most widely publicized murders in Japanese history. And every year since the murders, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department makes an annual pilgrimage to the house for memorial ceremonies, not only to commemorate the crime, but also to ask forgiveness that they have failed to discover the killer's identity and bring them to justice. We can only hope that one day the murderer is caught and punished for the truly horrific crimes they committed. But with every year that goes by, this outcome seems less and less likely, and that soon there will be a man walking among us who had it in them to take a nap after taking the lives of children. Jack Deiriki was born in Sacramento, California on December 25th of 1930. His maternal grandfather was something of a pioneer in the area and had built the main hotel at the corner of M and 6th Streets, where his parents worked up until the time when Jack was 10 years old. But during the spring of 1941, when he was just a 5th grader at the local Lincoln Grammar School, his family received a letter from Japan saying that his paternal grandfather was gravely ill. Jack's father was the eldest of his siblings and was honor-bound to be at his own father's side during his passing. So it was decided that the family would take a vacation over to Japan to visit so that Jack could reconnect with his Japanese roots. Jack's grandfather was living in the small village of Okugaitamura on the outskirts of a large industrial city. Fortunately, by September of 1941, he had almost completely recovered from the illness and was feeling significantly better. It was a great relief to Jack and his father, so they made the decision to return to the United States so that Jack could resume his schooling. But by that time, Japanese aggression in mainland China had pushed U.S. relations with the country to a breaking point. To their horror, the Deiriki family discovered that there were no civilian transport ships heading back across the Pacific to their home in America. They were effectively stranded, but Jack's education was paramount, and so he was enrolled in the local Japanese school to continue his studies, the same one his immigrant father had attended when he was Jack's age. Then just a few months later, disaster struck. The Japanese Air Force bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, killing and wounding over 3,000 American servicemen and women and causing millions of dollars in damages to U.S. warships. For the Deiriki family, there was no going back. For all intents and purposes, they were now prisoners on the Japanese mainland. 4 years later, Jack had adjusted to life in Japan. He was attending a technical school in the coastal city of Kure when, one day, he and his classmates were given the news that they would have to put their studies on hold for the foreseeable future. They were to be drafted into the war effort to work in a munitions factory. Jack was assigned to the Toyo factory on the outskirts of the large industrial city that he and his family were currently calling home, where he worked on a lathe which carved steel bars used in rifle manufacturing equipment. On the 24th of July, Kure, the city which he had just left a few weeks before, was burned to the ground by an American firebombing raid. A city which took 80 years to build was incinerated in just 2 hours. But Jack was grateful for the twist of fate that had allowed him to escape. He thought his new home would be safe from American air raids, as it had not been touched during the entire war and was assumed to be a target of strategic insignificance. But Jack was wrong to feel safe, because the city he now called home bore a name that would become synonymous with the horrors of aerial warfare. You see, the name of Jack's new home was Hiroshima. Early in the morning of August 6, 1945, Jack was roused from his sleep by an air raid warning. He was living in the suburbs with his family, who got out of bed and headed to the family bomb shelter to take cover from the expected bombing raid. But like so many air raid warnings before it, that one proved to be a false alarm. And so at around 7 a.m., Jack left for a nearby train station to join colleagues at the Toyo factory to begin their daily work. When he arrived at the factory around 45 minutes later, he noticed a single aircraft circling the city. It was a spotter plane, scouting out targets for future bombing raids. By 8 a.m., Jack had assembled with his colleagues in the factory courtyard to take part in the daily roll call. It was then that he looked up and saw 3 more aircraft circling in the sky, recognizing them as American B-29s from the sounds their engines made. Since there was only a handful of enemy aircraft, Japanese observers concluded that no air raid was about to take place, so warnings were given. No sirens sounded that morning. But they were wrong. There was to be an air raid that morning, but only one bomb was to be used, the most singular destructive bomb in human history. At 8:16, Jack and his Toyo factory colleagues were still lined up in the courtyard outside when there was a flash of light coming from the direction of downtown Hiroshima. To Jack, it was so bright that it seemed to be 10 times brighter than the sun in the sky, lighting up everything for miles around in a way that seemed almost impossible to him. Then, he was thrown through the air by the blast wave generated by the bomb's explosion, hitting the ground so hard it knocked the wind out of him. By the time he opened his eyes again, everything had gone black. The world around him was a maelstrom of dust and smoke. As he found his feet again, Jack heard hundreds of footsteps running from the nearby factory bomb shelter. He joined them, running almost blind for a moment or two before he reached the shelter's entrance. He could feel the heat of the blast on his back, and in the seconds before he descended the shelter's stairs, he turned to see something that was burned into his memory for the rest of his life. It was an atomic mushroom cloud, an image familiar to many of us from movies, games, and TV shows. But Jack was seeing one with his own eyes, a vision of destructive power so gargantuan that the gaze upon it was to lose a little piece of his mind. It was a column of fire that rose thousands of feet into the air above the obliterated city, the colors like nothing he had ever seen before, a tapestry of blood red, orange fire, sickly yellow, and burning azure. The entire city of Hiroshima was engulfed in flame and smoke. The factory workers sat in the darkness of the air raid shelter for over an hour, unable to quite comprehend what had just happened. To all but a handful of American scientists and military officials, the existence of an atomic weapon had remained a closely guarded secret. There was much speculation among the Toyo factory workers as to what had actually just occurred, but none could come to a complete consensus. Confusion and terror were rife in the factory bomb shelter that morning. After a long while sitting in the darkness without instruction, Jack climbed the stairs of the bomb shelter and dared to peek outside into the conflagration. What he saw was without a doubt the most horrifying thing he had ever seen in his life. It was a young woman walking past the shelter's entrance. She had her arms extended, feeling out the air in front of her. She had been looking directly toward the center of Hiroshima when the blast had occurred, and the bright flash had blinded her completely. She was completely bald, the heat of the explosion having burned all the hair off of her head, and her face was red and crisped from what became known as flash burns. Jack could see her clothes hanging loosely from her burned body and extended arms, but as the girl drew closer, Jack realized with absolute horror that it was not her shredded clothes that he was looking at that were hanging from her body. It was her flesh. The heat and intensity of the blast had cooked and melted the skin of her arms, but despite what we can safely assume was intense pain, she walked slowly, as if in a daze, and didn't make a single sound, a ghostly image that haunted Jack for the rest of his life. After what he'd seen, Jack couldn't summon the courage to peek out of the shelter again until noon that day. He and a few of his colleagues looked outside and saw the mushroom cloud that had cleared from the above city. In its place were huge, dark clouds that appeared as a steel-gray ceiling in the sky. Thunder rolled in the distance, and slowly it began to rain. The heat and pressure of the atomic explosion had caused tens of thousands of Hiroshima's denizens to become intensely dehydrated, and to them, the rain was a welcome relief. Those strong enough to do so walked out into the streets in droves, their open mouths raised to the sky to drink what little water they could that fell from the rain clouds above. But this was no ordinary rain. The raindrops fell thick and black upon those they landed on. The nuclear explosion had kicked up tons of radioactive dust into the atmosphere, heating and irradiating the clouds that now poured a deadly poisoned rain onto those below. Those that drank the rainwater had no way of knowing it, but the deluge was killing them. Even those with no visible injuries began to contract radiation sickness. Their hair began to fall out, their gums began to bleed, and over the next few days, those who the black rain fell upon dropped like flies. But Jack was lucky. He remained inside the shelter and did not become a victim of the horrifying and deadly meteorological phenomena. Since the Toyo munitions factory essentially fell under military control, they were subject to the same strict discipline and command system as their soldiery counterparts. They were not permitted to leave the bomb shelter until they had received orders to do so, and it took a full 7 hours before those in charge of the factory gave the workers approval to head back to their homes. As soon as he heard the order, Jack headed straight back towards the train station, in the hopes of catching a train back to the suburbs in order to check on his family and assure them that he was okay. Harrowing scenes greeted him as he walked the streets. Dozens of injured people limped and crawled away from the city's center with all manner of horrific injuries. Residents of local neighborhoods tried all they could to render aid, but there were no doctors, no medicine, nothing that could prevent the suffering of those that had suffered the effects of the bomb. Surprisingly, Jack found that the trains in Hiroshima were still running, ferrying those escaping the destruction away from the city in their hundreds. He jumped aboard one, but found it was an absolute horror show. The carriages were overflowing with the dead and dying, who lay on every available seat, as well as all over the floors. They begged Jack for help, and he despaired that he could give them none. The horror soon became too much for him to bear, and he jumped from the moving train in a moment of desperation. He then began a 10-mile walk back to the village where his family lived. Jack was lucky. He was spared the worst effects of the bomb, codename Little Boy. But when he arrived back at his family's house, he discovered that his aunt had not been so lucky. Shizuko was almost unrecognizable. She had been in downtown Hiroshima when the bomb was detonated, and the entire right side of her body, the side of her that was exposed to the impossible bright flash, was burned to a crisp. Japan's resources and the economy had been stretched to the limit by the war effort, and all medical supplies had been funneled to the Japanese military. So there was absolutely nothing in the way of first aid to be found in the Dairiki family home. So Jack's grandmother had to boil and mash potatoes in order to make some improvised bandages for her severely wounded daughter. The pain was so excruciating that she begged to die, and actually tried to end her own life a handful of times to end her own suffering. But each time, her family managed to restrain her, and it was only their careful interventions that prevented her from slipping away both from her wounds and from her own feverish will to end the pain. By the time her wounds healed, her right side had been so badly burned that her fingers had fused together, and an operation had to be performed in order to free her fingers from the grotesque scar tissue mitten that they had formed. Shizuko eventually recovered from her wounds and went on to have 3 healthy children, but, as Jack put it, she was a shadow of her former self, little more than a ghost. It is estimated that just over 80,000 Japanese civilians died in the moments following the bomb's detonation. Over the weeks that followed, a further 112,000 died as a result of radiation poisoning and other wounds sustained during the blast. This is mainly because there was very little in the way of medical assistance to be found in Hiroshima after the bombing. Before Little Boy wreaked its atomic devastation, Hiroshima had 55 hospitals, 200 doctors, and over 2,000 nurses. Afterwards, there were merely 3 hospitals, 20 doctors, and just over 100 nurses that remained alive in the city. The bombing of Hiroshima was the single most destructive act in human history, an awesomely terrifying display of scientific discovery combined with man's willingness to kill his fellow man. But it was still not enough to force a Japanese surrender, and so just a few days later, another atomic bomb was dropped in the city of Nagasaki. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito called on Japan to bear the unbearable and surrender to the United States. But the will to fight on was so strong among certain sections of the Japanese military that a group of army officers attempted a coup to remove the emperor and carry on the war. Fortunately, this failed, and on August the 14th, 1945, Imperial Japan officially surrendered. It took almost 2.5 years before Jack Deriki was able to return home to Sacramento, finally stepping foot on American soil in January of 1948. After graduating from the local high school, he enrolled in Sacramento City College to study architecture, and for a long time, he never spoke about his experiences during the war. Jack simply didn't want to talk about it, and it suited him that nobody bothered to ask. Until one day, when his pursuit of a degree in architecture required him to take a drawing class. The class was allowed to sketch anything they wished, and when prompted, Jack's memory of the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima came spilling out of him. It caused quite a stir, and Jack was interviewed by local newspapers and radio stations regarding his experiences, as the new Cold War with the Soviet Union had caused a huge surge of public interest in atomic warfare. Jack went on to have a long and successful life, designing houses, office spaces, and hospitals throughout the Bay Area, including the Kaiser Hospital in San Francisco. But he has always lived in the shadow of Hiroshima, as the Japanese call a hibakusha, a survivor of the bomb, a living witness of the darkest sides of humanity and the destructive power that can be unleashed when science and warfare intersect. And we can only pray that such destructive power will never be unleashed again. I was born and raised in West Virginia, but I've always had a huge fascination with Japanese culture. Ever since the day I saw the movie Grave of the Fireflies, I was just obsessed with all things Japan, which I suppose set me on the road to opting to pick Japanese as my college major, and as part of the course, I spent 6 months in Japan just sort of immersing myself in the language and culture. It was probably the greatest time of my life. Every single day was a dream come true for me, as it was something that I'd fantasized about since I was a little girl. The food was just out of this world. All the ramen, sushi, and yakisoba I could eat, and oh my god, the cocktail bars. Seriously, just take a moment and Google Japanese cocktail bartenders for a moment. I'm not sure which is more enjoyable, watching those guys make the drinks or actually drinking them. I also made a whole bunch of friends there, which laid the groundwork for me returning to work as a translator after my graduation. So for the past 5 years, I lived in the Namba district of Osaka and used the subway system to get to and from work every day. Anyway, so this one time, I'm walking towards the entrance of Nipponbashi's substation when I noticed the homeless dude camped out on the sidewalk not far from the entrance. He doesn't seem entirely all there because he's just sort of muttering to himself, pointing to passers-by and saying things under his breath. But he also happens to have a little tin cup-looking thing near him with a sign in Japanese, obviously where he was collecting spare change from generous members of the public. I've always been one of those people who fulfills their good deed for the day by passing homeless people a few dollars or something, so I head over towards him to put a few hundred yen in his little cup thing. As I get closer and drop a few coins into his cup, I manage to hear what he's actually saying. He points at this well-to-do looking businessman walking past as he says ningen, which is the Japanese word for human. I mean, I figured he was kind of crazy, so I didn't really think anything of it, so I walk off before catching the subway to work. That evening, on the way back, I'm walking out of the subway station when I see the same homeless dude sat there. He'd been there all day, and by the looks of things, he was still pointing at people and muttering things under his breath. But as I walk past, I realize he's not just saying human over and over again. He's saying all kinds of different things like pig, cow, chicken, all Japanese words for different animals. I got into my head that he was categorizing people by which animals he thought they looked like, which seemed a little rude, but like I said, he didn't really seem like he had it all together. So cut to the next morning, when I see the same homeless guy for a third time, and I decided to walk over to give him a little more spare change. I drop the coins in his cup, and just as I do, he points at some elderly woman walking past and says, "Noodles." My curiosity gets the better of me, and I ask, Noodles? Why'd you say noodles? The guy then raises a finger to his temple and starts explaining that he's a psychic, and that he is blessed with the ability to know the last thing a person ate that day. So obviously I asked him to use his abilities on me and asked him what it was that I had for breakfast that morning, to which he stares into my eyes for a moment before replying, "Bread." I was astounded. He absolutely nailed it, as I'd eaten toast that morning, my regular breakfast. So with this huge smile on my face, I tell him he was dead on the money, and I'm so impressed that I throw a few more coins in his little cup. He smiles as I wish him a good day before I head off to work. I'm serious, I was really impressed. Bread isn't exactly a common Japanese breakfast food, as they usually eat things like miso soup, steamed rice, natto, which is like fermented soybeans, or seaweed salad in the morning. I mean, he could have had a little knowledge of Western foods, but even then, it would have been a pretty good guess that I had toast that morning. It actually really brightened up my morning up until I remembered the first word that he'd said that day before. Human. He pointed at that businessman-looking guy and said, "Human." He wasn't just stating the obvious. He was able to psychically determine the last thing a person had eaten, and according to what I assumed was a pretty accurate ability, the last thing that business guy had eaten was human flesh. I know it's pretty silly of me, but I was really freaked out. I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the day, like as much as I wanted to just believe this guy was crazy. He seemed pretty cognizant when I actually spoke to him, and unless it was the world's best guess, he did seem like he knew what I'd eaten for breakfast that morning. I couldn't get the idea out of my head that there was a Japanese businessman out there that was part of some terrifying cult or secretive club whose rite of passage was eating human flesh. Like, I know it's pretty far-fetched, but like I said, that moment of realization really freaked me out for a while. I guess that's about the weirdest or scariest thing that happened to me while I was in Japan. The rest of my time there was amazing. I honestly can't wait to go back there on vacation, and I recommend traveling there to everyone with an interest in Japanese food or culture. But if you make it to Osaka and end up running into some hideous cannibalistic cult, don't say I didn't warn you. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, you should always wax your ball fro. Oh my god.